Rotten Tomatoes is a pointless website that does more harm than good to audiences and the film industry as a whole. Or at least that's the stance I will be arguing for in this video. As always, this series isn't about sharing my actual opinions on things, but rather exploring views I feel are somewhat divisive and interesting. After all, what weight do any of our views hold if we don't understand those we claim to disagree with? Let's begin with the obvious reason this collective metric doesn't work. Rotten Tomatoes is an aggregate of critics that takes all of their ratings, simplifies them as either positive or negative, then distills those ratings further into a single number. Anything 60% or higher is issued a fresh rating, and anything under 60% is designated rotten. This simplification of hundreds of critic reviews into one concrete figure takes out any nuance those critics actually have over a film. Maybe someone thinks a movie is very mediocre, but it's got an important underlying message, so they still recommend people see it. That's a thumbs up to Rotten Tomatoes. Maybe they think a film is well acted and well made, but feel it's too derivative of other works to give a positive rating. That's a thumbs down. Whether people believe these are legitimate reasons for critics to recommend or not recommend movies to their audiences, it is something that happens. But when distilled into a broader collective score, audiences are deprived of any of the nuance that gives those ratings meaning. An easy way to see this issue without having to dive into individual reviews is to look at the difference between the tomato score and the average critic rating of a film. For example, Beauty and the Beast has a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes with an average score of 8.5 from critics. The Secret of Nim also has a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes, but only a 7.5 critic rating. It's a much darker and less accessible movie, so the discrepancy isn't surprising. It doesn't have as broad an appeal. Even a movie like Mulan, which only had an 86% on Rotten Tomatoes, received a higher average critic score than The Secret of Nim did. Pinocchio has a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes with a 9.1 average critic score, while 101 Dalmatians has a 98% and an 8.2 average score. That's almost a full letter grade difference. Possibly, it's the result of the animal cruelty angle it presents. Or maybe it's something else, who knows. Lastly, Raya and the Last Dragon has a 93% with a 7.7 average critic score, which places it ahead of The Lion King's 92% with an 8.5 average score. Could I dig deeper into why Raya was so strongly recommended by critics in spite of its mediocre average ratings? Sure, but I'm not going to do that. Most people wouldn't. It's too much work to sift through a bunch of individual reviews to see what made that difference for so many critics. And that's one of the biggest problems. We've grown so accustomed to the simplicity of the Rotten Tomatoes score, it's hard not to rely on it, even knowing its flaws. We now glance at a number to determine whether or not a movie is worth seeing. A number that tends to favor films with broad appeal or certain messages over ones that cater to a specific audience. Individually, that's not very useful. We aren't aggregates. We have unique likes and dislikes. Our tastes are specific to ourselves. They're based on genre and the types of stories we've found we typically enjoy. Which leads me to my next issue with Rotten Tomatoes. Critics also have specific tastes. While this might seem like an obvious statement, I think it's an often overlooked one. Critics gravitate towards certain types of movies just like the rest of us, but their jobs require them to see anything that's likely to be popular. It's the nature of the business. Remember seeing that viral clip of Brie Larson calling out white male critics for criticizing A Wrinkle in Time?
I do not need a 40-year-old white dude to tell me what didn't work for him about A Wrinkle in Time. It wasn't made for him.
While a pretty bad take to have, there is actually some truth to this. The most valuable reviews and review consensus are going to come from those who like the same types of stories we do. If some critics being aggregated for a review on a Marvel film don't really like Marvel, they're less likely to give it a favorable rating. The Rotten Tomatoes number we get could be completely meaningless to our particular tastes. Apologies for once again straying from 2D, but it's the best example I have. As it turns out, I quite like cheesy disaster movies. The Day After Tomorrow, San Andreas, Geostorm, The Core. The problem is that very few critics share that opinion. If there's an upcoming disaster movie and I want to know if it's going to hit that right level of campy chaos I enjoy, I've found Rotten Tomatoes can't help me. I thought Moonfall was a solid movie, but it's got just 35% on this site. That type of thing's an inevitability when you have a film directed at a very specific audience that's then critiqued by all of the major critics. Many who went into seeing it already expected to dislike it, but had to see it as part of their jobs. And this discrepancy is showcased in the gap between the audience and critic scores of Moonfall and many others. It's the biggest reason why such rating deviations exist. They aren't the result of some giant Hollywood conspiracy, but rather differences between natural selection and forced selection. Audiences go to see movies they think they'll like, whether that's because of the genre, actors, or creative team behind the project. Movie critics don't have that luxury. They see as many films as they possibly can because that's what they do. Rotten Tomatoes would be much more valuable to audiences if they had critics list out their favorite genres and allowed viewers to see scores based on those criteria. It's more useful for fans of romance movies to look at aggregates of critics who love romance movies than ones that include everyone. Instead, all we have is a separate score for top critics, which is completely useless. What does that even mean? Actually, what would be cool is if there was a site that had you rate a whole bunch of movies to figure out what your tastes were, then create a curated list of critics most similar to you. Someone, make it happen. My other issue with Rotten Tomatoes is the site itself. They don't do a very good job of making their website usable for anyone interested in digging further into individual films. In fact, they make it difficult to find a lot of films. The site has a terrible search system. If you want to look up a movie that's based on a story that's been remade many times, you might have difficulty finding it. Everything's in chronological order. It's not based on popularity. Recently, when I searched for the animated Disney classic The Jungle Book, I was greeted with 10 movies that weren't what I was looking for. I needed to scroll down, click on the More Movies button, scroll up for some reason, click on the next button, then scroll down to the 6th result to find it. It's kind of absurd. The same thing happens when you look up Beauty and the Beast. Lots of scrolling, 2 button clicks, and the 4th result down on the 2nd page is the obvious 1991 version of Beauty and the Beast. Even when I could find what I wanted, some pages had no information on them. Why is Dumbo resulting in a largely blank page? Is it because of the controversial portrayal of some of the film's background characters? Probably not. I got the same results for Cinderella. That led me to momentarily consider its being related to how old these films are, but Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs shows up just fine. If I had to guess, I'd say the actual reason is issues with the website itself. Again, it's not a well-run resource. In the end, Rotten Tomatoes' simplistic number system does far more harm than good. It's a meaningless number. It doesn't tell the full story. In fact, I don't know that it tells any story. It's a blending of voices that just results in a bunch of noise. And yet, because of how quick and easy it is to look up, tons of people rely on it when making their decisions on what to see at their local theater. No wonder movie attendance keeps going down. Rotten Tomatoes, either intentionally or otherwise, has been tricking audiences into seeing movies they have no real reason to believe they'll actually like, and it's beginning to bear its spoiled fruit. Between 2002 and 2019, the number of movie tickets sold in the US went from 1.58 billion to 1.22 billion, according to the Numbers.com website. That's a decrease of 22.8%. When you factor in that the population went from 288 million to 328 million during that same time period, a 13.9% increase, that drop is all the more substantial. Rotten Tomatoes was founded at the end of 1998. Since it likely didn't start gaining traction right away, it's not surprising that we experienced a few years of peace before it started to aggressively kill off the movie industry. We can see from how often Rotten Tomatoes was searched for on Google that it climbed quickly in popularity until the middle of 2013 before beginning to fade. Rather than contradicting my point, this sudden stagnation only reinforces it. The aggregate website grew until the dwindling theatrical attendance led to fewer and fewer people having any reason to know what critics had to say. And we know theaters are the primary reason people have used Rotten Tomatoes, because of what we can see from Netflix's viewership numbers. Very few of the streaming giant's movies are recommended by critics, yet somehow Netflix movies are watched by an insane number of people. They're consistently critic-proof. If it's convenient and already included in an existing membership, audiences are much more willing to ignore the old tomato meter score. In conclusion, the only way for the film industry to survive and thrive is to put a stop to counterproductive services like Rotten Tomatoes. The thing that's truly rotten in Hollywood has been blatantly under our noses all along. Until next time, peace.